It's been about 3 months since the 1.0 launch of Last Epoch, and since then, it's been relatively quiet. I came back to Last Epoch not too long ago and saw a couple things from different content creators that I wanted to talk about. Nothing bad, just want to summarize what I've been seeing and give my opinion on the state of the game and what might be going on. TLDR, there's been some talk about Last Epoch and what happened to the player base. At the beginning of the year, there was all this hype for the 1.0 launch, like so much hype, more players than the game was able to handle, and then a pretty steep drop off of the player base. I'm late to the discussion, I know. I think some of you may remember that this topic was buzzing around in the YouTube scene about a month ago because of a video from Riker. In his video, he talks about how Last Epoch dropped somewhere north of 90% of players after the first 2 months, and he shares some ideas as to why that might be. Now, I'm not here to argue whether or not Riker's ideas are right or wrong, but his video did get me thinking on the subject. I recently saw that Darth Microtransaction did a poll asking his community if they were still playing Last Epoch. I, of course, being a part of his community, said yes, I still played because I log on maybe once or twice a week to try out some new builds and mess around with some endgame progression. I was obviously in the minority. And then just a couple days ago, a Last Epoch content and build guide creator that I watch and respect, Dreadful, made a post to his community generally speaking about how hard it is to be a content creator for Last Epoch, mostly because there's a lot of downtime in between major updates that would generate enough attention for videos and guides. And while I agree with him, Dread, Riker, DM, they all just got my brain spinning. Is Last Epoch really doing that bad? Is Last Epoch in trouble here? I feel like so many players are losing interest in the game that they're moving away to other things, which to me seems like a completely normal thing. This is the normal cycle of video games. I really don't think anything is wrong here. But I kind of wanted to address this idea that Last Epoch is somehow failing because of a lack of player retention 3 months after their 1.0 launch. I don't think anything is wrong with Last Epoch. I think there are perfectly normal reasons why the player base dropped off and why EHG is taking their time for the new cycle. But I also think that there are some hidden problems starting to show their face that may make it take a bit longer for EHG to see that 1.0 launch kind of success again. Okay, so why is Last Epoch failing? What is the reason behind this ugly Steam chart? Well, first of all, and probably the biggest reason, is because the hype train was so massive that in terms of sheer numbers, the large drop was almost inevitable. That's kind of how hype works. You build up a bunch of attention, players will enjoy the hype train build up, and then that hype bubble bursts. People will play the game, they play for however long they were going to play, hype or no hype, and then the player numbers regulate to where the healthy normal will be. Hype is an amazing marketing tool, but conversion is the metric you really want to follow. Of all those people that were on the hype train, how many actually stuck around? Well, if you actually look at the monthly averages, Last Epoch is doing great by its own standards. Even while the game is suffering player attrition while the devs prepare for the next cycle, the average number of players playing at any given moment is still 4 times higher than what it would be prior to the hype. I wish that gamers weren't so fixated on player numbers, or maybe that's just a content creator thing, but I don't think you can tell the health of a game just by looking at a 3-month window on a Steam chart. And to understand Last Epoch, I think you have to remember that before the hype train, before the massive influx of players and attention, this was a relatively small game. It was an indie game through and through with a small dev team and Kickstarter origins. Just because the game had a month of massive popularity doesn't automatically remove all the barriers to long-term success that an indie dev team will face. Which kind of brings me to the second half of this, the long dev cycles. Player attrition is not easy to deal with. Any game that releases major updates will have the same cycling trends for player numbers as they go through the downtime before the next release. I actually wanted to bring up Path of Exile here because I think Path of Exile is the perfect example of this in the ARPG space. Path of Exile is a seasonal game. GGG makes updates every 3 or 4 months that are like mini expansions. New content, balance updates, maybe a new boss, usually includes some new mechanic or feature of some sort. The Path of Exile player base has been conditioned to expect a new season to get hyped for. If you get burned out playing the game on the current season, don't worry. Take a break, play another game, the next season is coming soon. Last Epoch is trying to be similar, calling the seasons cycles instead. Which I think is a good idea because generally when you think of seasons, you think of 4 in a year. And Last Epoch may not be able to keep up with that schedule yet. Though I will point out that this trend isn't just an ARPG thing. When World of Warcraft releases a new patch, they see an influx of new players checking out what's new before those patch warriors get bored, and the player numbers return to the healthy norm. And those patches used to have like 6 months in between them. When single-player games release, they have a hyped launch with a bunch of players, and over time the player base will drop as people finish the game and move on. If a sequel comes out, great, then the sequel gets attention. If not, the game's community will dwindle until it's kept alive by speedrunners and nostalgia surfers. This isn't a bad thing though, this is just the natural order of life. Everything has hype, and everything will lose that hype over time. I mean, when I was born, there was a lot of hype for me, and now EHG just needs to keep up with the demand for good content. The dev cycles can be long and not hurt the game at all if the payoff is worth it. So is EHG doing that? Are they delivering good content in a reasonable time frame? Well, let's take the upcoming 1.1 release. We just got told will launch on July 9th, roughly 5 months after the 1.0 launch. So 5 months to come out with this. First, the big one. We have Harbingers and Pinnacle Boss. Singular, which I guess makes sense. He, she, it will be the Pinnacle Boss. I don't know what Harbingers will be, but having a Pinnacle Boss to test your build on will be amazing, and something I think Last Epoch really needs to round out the endgame. Next is the Random Encounter Nemesis feature, which, if I had to guess, will be something similar in scope to the Exiled Mages that are currently in the game. If that's true, can't wait. I think the Exiled Mages added some much-needed variants and monoliths. Last is a dodge roll, which I think is hilarious. I made all these jokes about games in 2024 needing to have a dodge roll in order to be part of the cool kids club, and now Last Epoch has joined in. To be honest, I don't mind a dodge roll at all. I think having a dodge opens up combat to be a bit more fast-paced and reduces a lot of the frustration of getting stuck in boss mechanics because your movement skill is on cooldown. It's also kind of restrictive for certain classes and builds if you need to have a movement skill on the skill bar, taking the place of potential damage or survivability skills, because you can get easily overwhelmed if you don't have mobility in an ARPG. Now, this isn't all of the content that's being delivered in 1.1. EHG has made sure to tell us that they're working on other things and it's just not listed there. So we can only guess how much content is coming, but for 5 months of development from an indie dev team, it seems like a pretty good deal. And keep in mind, the popularity of the 1.0 launch uncovered a lot of technical issues with the game that the team needed to address. Quite a few of them actually, so in my estimations, we're looking at about 3.5 months of dev time working on the new stuff. So again, going back to the question, is EHG releasing quality content in reasonable timeframes that will maintain and satisfy a rabid player base that consumes content faster than my 100-pound pit bull eats her dinner? Well, to answer that simply, yes, I think so. We will obviously know if the wait is worth it after 1.0 launches, but I think we have to give EHG that opportunity to make Last Epoch a great game, and 5 months is not that long to wait. For content creation, it sure is. Obviously, Dread has a good reason to not be happy about the wait, but for players, we have so many games to play. I have a backlog of like 20 games to play for YouTube reviews, and even more that I personally want to try. I'm more than happy to wait for 5 months for some quality content. But there are definitely some problems that this brings up. Things that EHG needs to be mindful of in the future as they grow the game to become one of the big players in the space. First, and I hope this goes without saying, but EHG needs to focus on releasing content without bugs. 1.0 was a huge launch with loads of content, so it's understandable that it had new bugs, and of course, the huge jump in player numbers didn't help the situation. But if 1.1 comes out and EHG spends a couple months after that fixing bugs, that'll push out the new cycle, so the time between 1.1 and 1.2 becomes longer, and less players will stick around. Not to mention that all the hype players at patch launch will be playing a buggy or nearly unplayable version of the game, and that's just not a good way to convert any of those hype players to dedicated Last Epoch fans. Second, less important but still an issue in my mind, I think we need to understand a bit more about how cycles are going to work. More specifically, we need to know how long these cycles are going to be. If there are resets every cycle, then that means the characters I make now aren't permanent. So how invested should I really get if the next cycle is coming up? I do this all the time in Path of Exile. I'll create my main character at the beginning of a season, I'll create more alts in the middle of a season, and once it gets towards the end of the season, I always get unmotivated and say, well, I'll just wait till the next season to start a new character because it'll reset and I want to play in the new league. On top of that, if we don't know when a new cycle is coming, now we're playing against an unknown clock. It could be a 3-month cycle, it could be a 5-month cycle, could it be longer? Should I start investing in a new build if the cycle could be a month from now? I think it'll help EHG if they can set expectations with the player base so they know when to come back. Yeah, of course, they'll probably announce it at least a month in advance, so it's not like a new cycle will just happen without warning and you lose all your progress. But I've already learned a lot of people say that they left like 2 weeks after launch and are waiting for the next cycle to come back. They probably aren't following the Last Epoch Discord or subscribed to the official YouTube channel like I am. They're probably paying attention to a million other games at the same time. So what's the likelihood that they'll see this announcement for the next cycle and then come back? I guess we'll see for the 1.1 cycle. Third, not necessarily a problem, but definitely something we need to keep in mind, Last Epoch is still a base game. It's a 1.0 launch ARPG, which means it'll take time for the game to be polished and have the same amount of content as games like Grim Dawn, Path of Exile, and even D4. This means that players may not spend thousands of hours in the game right now. I mean, I have, but not everyone will. The game doesn't have an endless amount of content right now, and that's okay. We need to be patient and wait for EHG to do their thing and keep giving us a solid, some would say great, ARPG that over time will just keep getting better and better. In fact, we really need to keep this in mind when looking at player numbers in the future. The game will take a while to get up to the standards of the big players in the space, at least in terms of the amount of content. So if Last Epoch is getting 4K average players a day 3 months into a cycle, it doesn't mean that the game is dead. It just means that more content is on the way and players are trying out other games while they wait. Doomsaying won't make the game any better. It'll just cause unnecessary panic. Hopefully you all are still having fun with Last Epoch, Path of Exile, or maybe D4, which I hear is doing pretty well right now, or literally the hundreds of other games that are out there that are fighting for your limited time and attention. But most importantly, I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave a like if you liked it, and subscribe for more content. I hope you enjoy the 1.1 cycle when it finally comes out, and I can't wait to see what we talk about next.